Sarah opened her mailbox on a cool autumn morning. The trees around Clearwater Lake were showing their first hints of gold and orange. Among the usual bills and advertisements, she noticed an official-looking envelope with the Lakeside Homeowners Association logo stamped in the corner. She frowned, not expecting any communication from them this month. Back inside her lakefront home, she set her coffee down on the kitchen counter and tore open the envelope. Her eyes scanned the formal letter, quickly, then widened in disbelief. She had to read it twice to make sure she understood correctly. "You've got to be kidding me," she muttered, shaking her head. The letter informed her that her husband Robert needed to remove his fishing boat from their private dock within 2 weeks. According to the HOA, the vessel violated community guidelines about unsightly watercraft and had generated numerous complaints from neighbors. If they failed to comply, they would face a fine of $100 per day. Sarah looked out the kitchen window at the boat in question. It wasn't brand new by any means, but Robert maintained it meticulously. The 22-foot fishing boat had been his pride and joy for over a decade, used almost weekly for his fishing trips on the lake. There was absolutely nothing unsightly about it. She set the letter down and rubbed her temples. Robert would be home from work in a few hours, and she wasn't looking forward to showing him this. He'd been butting heads with some HOA board members lately, particularly the new president, Tom Harmon, who moved in last year and seemed determined to enforce every minor rule in the community handbook. When Robert's truck pulled into the driveway, that evening Sarah was waiting on the porch. Even before he reached the steps, he could tell something was bothering her. "What's wrong?" he asked, climbing the stairs with his lunch cooler in hand. "We got a letter from the HOA today," she said, passing him the notice. "It's about your boat." Robert's expression darkened as he read. By the time he finished, his face had turned a deep shade of red. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice tight with anger. "That boat has been docked there for 10 years without any issues." "I know," Sarah said. "I think it's Tom. Remember how he complained about John's basketball hoop last month and the Wilsons' garden gnomes?" Robert paced the porch, running his hand through his graying hair. "This isn't about aesthetics. Tom's fishing club wanted to use our dock for their tournament last month, and I said no because we had family visiting." He shook his head. "This is payback, plain and simple." That night after dinner, Robert disappeared into his office. Sarah could hear him opening and closing drawers, shuffling through papers. When he finally emerged, he was carrying a worn leather folder filled with yellowed documents. "My grandfather showed me these years ago," he explained, spreading the papers across the dining table. "When he developed this area in the 1940s, he sold the lots but kept ownership of the actual lake." Sarah leaned forward, looking at the property deeds and water rights certificates. "So the HOA doesn't control the lake at all?" "Not an inch of it," Robert confirmed. "He transferred ownership to my father, who passed it to me. We've always been generous about letting the community use it for recreation, but legally speaking, that water is private property." "Does the HOA know this?" Sarah asked. "They should. It's in all the property records." Robert's expression softened as he looked at an old photograph of his grandfather standing proudly beside the lake. "Grandfather always believed in sharing what we had with the community. That's why he never restricted access." Sarah squeezed his hand. "What are you going to do?" Robert carefully returned the documents to their folder. "I'm going to attend next week's HOA meeting and remind them who actually owns Clearwater Lake." A small, determined smile crossed his face. "And I'm not moving my boat an inch." As he closed the folder, Sarah noticed a gleam in her husband's eyes she hadn't seen in years. She knew that look. Tom Harmon and the HOA had no idea what they had just started, or who they were really dealing with. Robert Leavitt had a deep connection to Clearwater Lake that went far beyond just owning a house on its shore. His grandfather had bought the entire lake and all the land around it back in the 1940s when the area was nothing but wilderness. The old man had a vision for a peaceful community where families could enjoy nature together. Over the years, his grandfather developed part of the property into the neighborhood that now stood, selling lots to carefully selected families who shared his love for the outdoors. But what most current residents didn't know was that the Leavitt family had kept ownership of the lake itself. This wasn't just some HOA-controlled community amenity. It was private property that had been in Robert's family for 3 generations. "My grandfather was a generous man," Robert told his wife as they sat on their back porch watching the sunset reflect on the water. "He let everyone use the lake because he believed natural beauty should be shared." Robert smiled at a distant memory. "I remember when I was just a kid, Grandpa would take me fishing at dawn. He knew every spot where the bass would bite. He taught me that owning something comes with responsibility, not just rights." The Clearwater Fishing Club had started, with just a handful of his grandfather's friends. Now it had grown to over 50 members who held tournaments, taught local kids to fish, and even did conservation work to keep the lake healthy. Robert had maintained his grandfather's tradition of allowing them to use the family's lake freely. "The club members don't even realize they've been guests all these years," Robert mused. "They think the lake belongs to everyone." His wife looked concerned. "Do you think this will cause problems with your friends in the club? Many of them are on the HOA board." Robert nodded slowly. "That's what worries me. Tom has been president of both the HOA and the fishing club since last year. I'm not sure if he genuinely doesn't know about the lake's ownership or if he's deliberately ignoring it." The next morning, Robert called his cousin Patricia, who worked at the county records office. She agreed to make copies of all the relevant documents: the original deed to the property, water rights certificates, and the subsequent transfers from his grandfather to his father, and finally to him. "These records are clear as day," Patricia told him when he picked up the thick folder of papers. "The subdivision agreements specifically exclude the lake itself from community property. Your grandfather was smart. He even had special language added to protect the family's rights in case a homeowners association formed in the future." Robert spent hours that evening reviewing everything. There was no question about it. Legally speaking, Clearwater Lake belonged entirely to him. The easements his grandfather had granted were voluntary and, importantly, revocable. As he studied a survey map showing the exact boundaries, he remembered all the work his family had put into creating and maintaining this place. His grandfather had the lake dredged to create its perfect depth. His father had invested in water quality management to keep it pristine. And Robert himself had paid thousands over the years for stocking fish and invasive species control. Costs the HOA never offered to share. "I've never wanted to restrict anyone," Robert told his wife later. "But if they're going to start dictating what I can do on my own property, they need to understand exactly where their authority ends, which is at the shoreline." The following Sunday, Robert took his boat out early. He navigated slowly around the lake's perimeter, noting all the docks that extended from neighbors' properties onto his lake. Many had been built without ever asking permission. He counted 3 boathouses that technically sat on Leavitt water rights. The fishing club's storage shed was entirely on his property. All these years, he thought, we've been good neighbors, never complained, never restricted access, never charged a fee. And this is how they thank us, with violation notices and threats. When Robert returned home, he began preparing for the HOA meeting scheduled for Tuesday evening. He organized his documents, practiced what he would say, and tried to prepare himself for the confrontation ahead. This wasn't just about a boat anymore. This was about respect, family legacy, and standing up for what was rightfully his. "Whatever happens," he told himself as he looked out at the sparkling waters of Clearwater Lake, "Grandpa would expect me to handle this with dignity, but he'd also expect me to protect what belongs to our family." In the weeks that followed the HOA meeting, the situation at Clearwater Lake grew increasingly tense. Robert kept his boat firmly docked where it had always been, while the HOA doubled down on their demands. A new notice arrived, this one increasing the potential fine to $200 per day, with a threat of placing a lien on their property if left unpaid. "They can't really do that, can they?" Robert's wife asked as they read the latest letter over breakfast. "Not legally," Robert said, "but they're counting on us not fighting back." The conflict was no longer just about the boat. It had become a battle over power and control in the community they'd called home for over 20 years. Robert noticed neighbors treating them differently. Some were openly hostile, crossing the street to avoid conversation. Others whispered behind their backs at the local grocery store. Tom Harmon had launched what appeared to be a deliberate campaign against them. The community newsletter, which Tom edited, included a front-page article about selfish homeowners who put personal interests above community harmony. Though no names were mentioned, everyone knew who it referred to. More troubling were the rumors spreading through the neighborhood. Some claimed Robert was planning to sell the lake to developers. Others suggested he wanted to charge residents for access. None of this was true, but the whispers grew louder with each passing day. One evening, Robert received a call from Jack Wilson, who had been president of the fishing club for nearly a decade before Tom took over. "I wanted to check if you're still coming to the planning meeting for the summer tournament," Jack said awkwardly. "Some members are wondering." "Of course I'm coming," Robert replied. "I've helped organize it for 15 years. Why wouldn't I?" A long pause followed. "Well, Tom suggested it might be better if you didn't attend given the current situation. He said your presence could be disruptive." Robert gripped the phone tighter. "Did everyone agree with that?" "Not everyone," Jack admitted. "But Tom convinced enough people. I'm sorry, Robert. This whole thing has gotten out of hand." After hanging up, Robert paced around the house, his anger building. The fishing club had been a huge part of his life. His grandfather had been a founding member. Robert himself had taught countless kids to fish through the club's youth programs. Now he was being pushed out by someone who had moved in just last year. The next morning, Robert found a group of HOA board members standing at the edge of his property, taking photos of his boat and dock. When he approached them, they scattered like startled birds. Later that day, flyers appeared on every door in the neighborhood announcing an emergency HOA meeting to vote on new regulations, specifically targeting watercraft storage and exclusive use of community resources. The meeting was scheduled for a date when Robert had previously mentioned he would be out of town for a work commitment. His wife called Tom to request a change of date, but he refused, claiming the matter was too urgent to delay. It was becoming painfully clear that the HOA board was determined to push their agenda through without Robert's input. Even more hurtful was the sudden distance from people they had considered friends for years. Their neighbor Pete, who had seemed supportive after the first meeting, now avoided eye contact when they passed each other. The Johnsons, who had attended their holiday parties for a decade, suddenly became too busy to stop and chat. "They're isolating us," Robert told his wife one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset over the lake. "Making us seem like the bad guys for simply defending what's rightfully ours." She squeezed his hand. "What are you going to do?" Robert watched a pair of ducks glide across the water's surface. His grandfather had introduced those wood ducks to the lake in the 1950s, and their descendants still returned every year. This place wasn't just property to him, it was family heritage. "I think it's time to talk to a lawyer," he finally said. "I've tried to be reasonable, but they're not interested in facts or compromise. They want control, and they'll keep pushing until someone pushes back." The next day, Robert scheduled an appointment with Patricia Reynolds, an attorney specializing in property rights. As he gathered his documents for the meeting, he felt a strange mix of sadness and determination. He had never wanted this fight, but he wasn't going to let his family's legacy be stolen through intimidation and community politics. What had started as a simple dispute about a boat had evolved into something much more significant, a test of wills that would ultimately determine who truly controlled the waters of Clearwater Lake. The law office of Reynolds and Associates was located in a converted Victorian house downtown. Patricia Reynolds greeted Robert warmly in a conference room filled with law books and potted plants. Her reputation as one of the best property rights attorneys in the state had made Robert feel hopeful for the first time in weeks. "So you believe you own an entire lake that a homeowners association is trying to control?" Patricia said, reviewing the documents Robert had brought. "This should be interesting." For the next 2 hours, Patricia carefully examined every page of the deeds, water rights certificates, and property transfers. She traced the history of ownership from Robert's grandfather through to the present day. She paid special attention to the subdivision agreements created when the residential lots were first sold. "Mr. Leavitt," Your documentation is remarkably thorough, she finally said, looking up from the papers. Most family property disputes I handle don't have such clear records. My grandfather was careful about legal matters, Robert explained. He wanted to make sure the lake would stay in the family forever. Patricia nodded, organizing the documents into neat piles. Based on everything you've shown me, your ownership of Clearwater Lake is absolute and legally binding. The subdivision agreements clearly show that when your grandfather sold the residential lots, he explicitly retained all rights to the lake itself. Robert felt a wave of relief. So the HOA has no authority over the lake or my dock? None whatsoever, Patricia confirmed. Their jurisdiction ends at the shoreline. They can regulate the appearance of houses, yards, and common areas within the subdivision, but they have zero authority over the water or anything on it. What about their claim that decades of community use gives them some kind of right to control it? Patricia shook her head. They might be thinking of adverse possession, but that doesn't apply here. Your family hasn't abandoned the property. You've actively maintained it. More importantly, you've explicitly permitted community use. Permission negates any adverse possession claim. She leaned forward, her expression serious. What's particularly interesting is that the easements your grandfather granted for recreational use were voluntary and revocable. Do you understand what that means? Robert thought for a moment. That I could technically restrict access to the lake if I wanted to. Exactly, Patricia said. You've allowed the community to use your private property as a courtesy, but legally speaking, you could revoke that permission at any time. The thought made Robert uncomfortable. His grandfather had always believed in sharing the lake with neighbors. The idea of restricting access went against family tradition. I don't want to stop people from enjoying the lake, he said. I just want the HOA to back off and respect my property rights. Patricia nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes in these situations, you need to demonstrate what's at stake before the other party will negotiate reasonably. She pulled out a legal pad and began writing. I'm going to draft 2 letters. The first will go to the HOA board, explaining your legal ownership and demanding they rescind all violation notices related to your boat or dock. The second will be addressed to the Clearwater Fishing Club, informing them that their permission to use the lake is under review. Robert shifted uncomfortably. The fishing club? Many of those people are my friends. Trust me, Patricia said gently. Sometimes you need to show strength to achieve peace. We'll make it clear that you're not immediately revoking access, but that continued harassment from the HOA could result in restrictions. As Patricia continued outlining the legal strategy, Robert gazed out the window. He remembered summer evenings when his grandfather would tell stories about the early days at Clearwater Lake, how he'd chosen each family who bought a lot, how he'd designed the community to foster neighborliness and shared enjoyment of nature. What would Grandpa do in this situation? Robert wondered. The old man had been generous but not a pushover. He believed in standing up for what was right. Patricia interrupted his thoughts. There's one more thing you should know, she said. Those docks that neighbors have built extending into the lake? Technically, they're encroaching on your property. The same goes for the boathouses in the fishing club's storage shed. Robert's eyes widened. I never thought about that. You've been a very accommodating neighbor, Patricia said with a smile. But it might be time to remind everyone exactly who owns Clearwater Lake and what that means for all of them. As Robert drove home, the setting sun cast long shadows across the water. Boats were scattered across the lake. Families fishing, teenagers swimming off docks, an elderly couple in a rowboat, all of them enjoying his property, most without ever acknowledging or perhaps even knowing that fact. He didn't want to be the villain in this story. But he also couldn't allow the HOA to bully him off his own property. With Patricia's legal confirmation backing him up, Robert made a difficult decision. It was time to take a stand, even if it meant temporarily disrupting the peace of Clearwater Lake. The certified letters arrived at their destinations on a Tuesday morning. One went to Tom Harmon as president of the HOA. Another went to the Clearwater Fishing Club headquarters. Others were delivered to every household with docks extending into the lake. Each contained professionally drafted legal notices from Patricia, Reynolds representing Robert Leavitt, the legal owner of Clearwater Lake. Robert had agonized over taking this step, but the HOA had left him no choice. Rather than removing his boat as demanded, he had decided to assert his rights completely. The letters explained in clear, simple language that Robert owned the lake and all its waters. The easements allowing community use had been voluntary, and were now formally revoked due to ongoing harassment from the Homeowners Association. By mid-afternoon, Robert's phone was ringing nonstop. Neighbors who hadn't spoken to him in weeks suddenly wanted to talk. He let the calls go to voicemail, following Patricia's advice to avoid direct confrontations that might escalate the situation. As evening approached, Robert and his wife watched. From their living room window as small groups formed on the community beach, people were reading papers and gesturing toward the water. Some looked shocked, others appeared angry. "Do you think we went too far?" his wife asked. Robert sighed. "They didn't leave us any options. They wanted to dictate what I could do with my property while claiming rights they never had." The letter to the fishing club had been the hardest to send. It canceled the upcoming annual tournament and revoked permission for club activities on the lake. Robert had helped organize that tournament for 15 years. His grandfather's photo still hung in the club's meeting hall, but Tom had made the club another weapon in his campaign against Robert, so it had to be included in the response. Early the next morning, Robert hired a local contractor to begin installing private property and no trespassing signs around the lake's perimeter. By noon, a news van from the local station had arrived, parking at the community entrance. Tom had apparently called them, hoping to gain public support. Robert was trimming hedges in his front yard when the reporter approached. She was young and eager, thrusting a microphone toward him. "Sir, neighbors are saying you've claimed ownership of the entire lake and are threatening to evict longtime residents from using it. Can you comment on these allegations?" "Those aren't allegations," Robert replied calmly. "They're facts, though somewhat mischaracterized. I don't claim to own the lake. I do own it. My family has owned it since 1943. We've generously allowed community use for decades, but recent actions by the HOA have forced me to reassert my property rights." The reporter looked surprised by his straightforward answer. "But isn't this lake the centerpiece of the community? Residents say their home values depend on lake access." Robert nodded. "That's precisely why my grandfather allowed shared use. He wanted a harmonious community. Unfortunately, the current HOA leadership has attempted to control property they don't own and punish me for having a boat on my own dock." That evening, the story ran on local news. Robert watched as neighbors gave emotional interviews about traditions being destroyed and property values plummeting. Tom appeared on camera calling Robert's actions selfish and destructive to community spirit, conveniently omitting how the dispute had started. The following day brought a flood of emails from residents, ranging from angry accusations to confused questions to expressions of support. Several older neighbors who had known Robert's grandfather wrote to say they'd always understood the lake belonged to the Leavitt family, but had forgotten as the years passed. By week's end, tensions reached a breaking point. Robert spotted several teenagers deliberately trespassing on the lake, crossing directly in front of his property in a small boat while shouting insults. Later, he found his mailbox knocked over and tire tracks across his lawn. When Robert arrived, home from work the next evening, he found a group of about 30 residents gathered on his front lawn. His first instinct was alarm until he recognized Frank, the HOA treasurer, standing on his porch steps. As Robert approached cautiously, Frank raised his hands to show he came in peace. "We'd like to talk," Frank said. "Not as the HOA, but as neighbors who've let things get out of hand." Frank and Robert stood on the porch while the gathered neighbors waited quietly on the lawn. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. A week of signs, legal notices, and canceled lake activities had shaken the community to its core. "We've made a mistake," Frank said, his voice carrying to the crowd. "Several of us on the board reviewed the legal documents thoroughly. There's no question that the lake belongs to the Leavitt family and always has." Murmurs rippled through the assembled neighbors. Some nodded in agreement, while others looked surprised. Tom Harmon has resigned as HOA president, Frank continued. There was a special vote this morning. The board felt his handling of this situation was inappropriate. Robert noticed Tom wasn't among the gathered neighbors. Where is he? Robert asked quietly. He's packing, Frank replied. Apparently he's been planning to move for months. The lake dispute was his parting gift to the community. Robert wasn't sure whether to feel vindicated or just tired. The whole conflict had drained him emotionally. Frank turned to address the crowd. For those who don't know the history, Robert's grandfather bought this entire area in 1943. When he developed our neighborhood, he kept ownership of the lake itself. The Leavitt family has allowed us all to use it out of goodness, not obligation, and a older woman stepped forward. I remember Mr. Leavitt Sr. He taught my boys to fish right off that dock. He never made a fuss about owning the lake because that wasn't his way. He just wanted people to enjoy it. Frank nodded. The Leavitt family has paid for lake maintenance, fish stocking, and water quality testing for decades without asking for a penny from the HOA or residents. They've been quietly generous while we've taken their kindness for granted. Robert felt a lump forming in his throat. His grandfather would have appreciated these words. We're here tonight, Frank continued, to apologize and to ask if you'd consider allowing the community access to the lake again. All eyes turned to Robert. He looked at the faces of his neighbors, people he'd lived alongside for years. There was genuine regret in many of their expressions. I never wanted to restrict anyone's enjoyment of the lake, Robert said finally. That wasn't the point of all this. I just wanted respect for property rights that have been in my family for generations. We understand that now, Frank replied, and we're prepared to formalize that respect with a proper agreement. From his briefcase, Frank produced a document. The board has drafted a new community agreement that explicitly acknowledges the Leavitt family's ownership of Clearwater Lake. It establishes clear boundaries between HOA authority and your private property rights. It also proposes a small annual contribution from the HOA budget toward lake maintenance, something we should have done years ago. Robert took the paper and skimmed it. The terms were reasonable, fair even. It was everything he'd wanted from the beginning. What about the fishing club? Robert asked. A man stepped forward. Jack Wilson, the former club president. We'd like to reorganize under new leadership. The annual tournament was always your grandfather's tradition. It doesn't feel right to lose it. Robert looked out at the water, remembering all the summers spent on its surface. His grandfather had created this place not just as a home but as a community. Fighting over it went against everything the old man had stood for. I'll need to review this agreement with my attorney, Robert said finally. But assuming everything's in order, I'm willing to restore lake access and work together moving forward. The relief among the neighbors was palpable. Several people clapped and others nodded appreciatively. One condition, though, Robert added. The new agreement needs to include historical recognition. I want a small plaque placed at the community dock that acknowledges my grandfather's contribution to creating Clearwater Lake in this neighborhood. I think that's more than fair, Frank agreed, extending his hand. As Robert shook it, he felt a weight lifting. The dispute had been painful but perhaps necessary. Sometimes boundaries needed to be tested to be strengthened. Over the following months, things slowly returned to normal at Clearwater Lake. The private property signs came down. The fishing tournament was rescheduled and drew a record turnout. A small ceremony was held to place a bronze plaque honoring Robert's grandfather. Most importantly, the community found a new balance, one built on mutual respect rather than assumptions. Robert kept his boat proudly docked where it had always been. No one complained about it again. Sometimes, standing on his dock at sunset, Robert would think about his grandfather and the legacy he'd created. The old man had understood something important. True ownership wasn't just about legal rights but about stewardship. Clearwater Lake belonged to the Leavitt family on paper, but its purpose had always been to bring people together. That, Robert decided, was a family tradition worth preserving above all others.